Welcome back to Fine Tuning with Drew Taylor, your one-stop shop when it comes to animation news and commentary. I'm entertainment writer Jim Hill, and Mr. Taylor, whose writings on the industry you can regularly read over on The Wrap, and whose musings on the Mission Impossible movies you can listen to on the Light the Fuse, the official Mission Impossible podcast. Well, Drew ain't here today. We had some tech issues when Mr. Taylor and I initially went to record this week's show back on Friday, May 24th, and rather than hold Drew, Katie, and Nova up, they were headed out to Palm Springs for a well-deserved break. Over the long Memorial Day weekend, I offered to do this week's podcast as a solo show. Little did I know that as soon as Mr. Taylor would drive off into the Sonoran Desert in Southern California, that we'd then get hit with one of the biggest animation news-related weeks of the year. We're talking about how the Garfield movie nearly bested Furiosa, a Mad Max saga at the domestic box office, which, according to industry pundits, wasn't supposed to happen. Then we have the sad passing of Disney legend Dick Sherman, not to mention a brand new documentary celebrating the legacy of Walt Disney Feature Animation Florida, which debuted on YouTube this past Friday, May 24th. Which is why it took me till Monday, May 27th, to finally sit down and try to record this week's show. By the way, it's Memorial Day here in the States. As a veteran myself, I'd like to say, for those of you who spent time in uniform, thanks for your service. And for those of you who lost friends and family, I am so sorry for your loss. Anyway, there's a lot to get to today, so let's get started. But before we plunge into the news segment of today's show, I just want to remind you that the news portion of Fine Tuning is brought to you by TouringPlans.com. If you're headed down to Orlando anytime soon to sample some of the many theme parks that you will find around the city beautiful, well, Touring Plans has the info you need to make the smartest use of your time when you're down in Central Florida. So please check them out at TouringPlans.com. Okay, so let's get started with what happened at the domestic box office this past weekend, because, well, isn't Garfield supposed to hate Mondays? That's what this Jim Davis comic strip has been telling us since it first launched back in June of 1978, that this lasagna-loving cat supposedly despises the first day of the week. Well, given the current box office trends, Furiosa, the latest installment in George Miller's Mad Max saga, was originally projected to sell at least $50 million worth of tickets in North America over its opening weekend. As of right now, it looks like Furiosa will be lucky if it winds up hauling in just $33 million domestically over the long Memorial Day weekend. Now, mind you, the Garfield movie was always supposed to be the family-friendly alternative to Furiosa, which is why industry pundits were saying that this Mark Dindal movie would be lucky if it could sell 30 million, over its opening weekend in North America. So you get the narrative, right? Furiosa, supposed to be number one at the box office of the long Memorial Day weekend by a very big number, and the Garfield movie was supposed to be a distant number two. Well, as of this particular Monday morning, and we're waiting on the final box office numbers, by the way, Furiosa and the Garfield movie are pretty much neck and neck when it comes to North American ticket sales. They're 30 million plus each. And later this afternoon, it said that it's quite possible that the Garfield movie will pull into the lead because of holiday matinees. And which is why I say, yeah, Garfield may hate most Mondays, but not Monday, May 27, 2024. Now, just to be clear here, the Garfield movie has a 1 hour and 41 minute long running time, where Furiosa, a Mad Max saga, clocks in at 2 hours and 28 minutes, and that 45-minute long difference in the Garfield movie and Furiosa's running time Well, as anyone who's actually worked an exhibition will tell you, that then translates into the Garfield movie being able to get in at least one more screening and in some cases two more screenings per day than Furiosa, a Mad Max saga, which is going to have an impact on the overall box office potential for that George Miller movie. By the way, this box office trend is continuing overseas, where Furiosa is racking up lower than expected ticket sales, 59 million to date, whereas the Garfield movie internationally sits at a fat and happy 91 million. Though, to be fair, this Martindale movie did begin playing in select overseas markets 3 weeks ago, so the Garfield movie got a bit of a head start on Furiosa, at least as far as foreign ticket sales are concerned. That said, will this Tubby Tabby ultimately pass Po, the portly panda who stars in DreamWorks' Kung Fu Panda film series, when it comes to the 2024 worldwide box office? That seems kind of unlikely. Kung Fu Panda 4, which effectively wrapped up its run at the box office, now sits at 539 million in worldwide ticket sales, which puts the latest installment of this DreamWorks series just ahead of its predecessor, Kung Fu Panda 3, which, when it debuted in theaters back in January of 2016, that one sold $521 million worth of tickets worldwide. And just in case you're wondering, the top grossing film in this series was actually Kung Fu Panda 2. That premiered in theaters back in May of 2011 and would eventually go on to sell $665 million worth of tickets worldwide, which is slightly better than the original Kung Fu Panda did when it debuted in theaters back in June of 2008. That DreamWorks animation film sold $631 million worth of tickets worldwide. By the way, since we've previously mentioned on this podcast how Guillermo del Toro has stated that owning physical media these days has reached almost a Fahrenheit 451 level of responsibility, well, I now like to add what Christopher Nolan has been saying about owning books about your favorite movies, not to mention Blu-rays and DVDs of these same films. How when you put items like this in your media library, no evil streaming service can ever steal them from you. By the way, that's a direct quote from Nolan. I bring that up because tomorrow, Tuesday, May 28th, the Blu-ray and DVD of Kung Fu Panda 4 goes on sale. Not only that, but 7 weeks from now, on Tuesday, July 16th, the Art of DreamWorks Kung Fu Panda 4 goes on sale. This 176-page hardcover is being published by Cameron Books. Not only that, but the Art of DreamWorks Kung Fu Panda 4 has been written by Tracy Miller Zarnek, who wrote the first 3 installments of the Art of Kung Fu Panda series. And Tracy's a pro when it comes to writing Art of animated feature books. She wrote the Art of Disney's Meet the Robinsons, the Art and Making of Sony Pictures Animation, Hotel Transylvania. Likewise, one of my favorite coffee table books, at least when it comes to animation production, The Art of DreamWorks, How to Train Your Dragon. I have to tell you, I must have at least a dozen or more of this woman's books in my animation reference library. But you know who else does a great job when it comes to writing these Art of Making of animated feature books? Our own Drew Taylor. His first book of this kind, The Art of Pixar's Onward, came out back in March of 2022. A little side note here, folks. Just this past week, Brian Gunn, who I do the Looking at Lucasfilm podcast with, journeyed down to the Disneyland Resort with his very own copy of The Art of Disney Pixar Onward, the book that Drew wrote. And the reason that Brian went down there is, well, they're running the Pixar Fest at the resort through August 4th. And in the Fantasyland Theater at Disneyland Park, they've got this thing set up called the Pixar Pals Playtime Party, which is a lot of P's put together. Anyway, and inside of this space, they've got all sorts of elaborate meet and greet setup. For example, you can get your picture taken with the title character from Pixar's Luca, along with his pal Alberto, in front of this giant picture postcard version of Porto Rosso. Likewise, you can pose with Carl and Ellie's mailbox while the flying house from Pixar's Up hovers in the background. But the reason that Brian traveled down to Anaheim is, well, there's an onward photo op to be had at this year's Pixar Fest, which features walk-around versions of Ian and Barley Lightfoot, the two lead characters of that Pixar film, as well as a full-size version of Guinevere, Barley's tricked-out van. Anyway, Mr. Gone got a picture of himself holding Drew's Art of Pixar Disney's Onward book with the walk-around version of Barley with Guinevere in the background. And I have to tell you, Mr. Taylor was thrilled with this picture. And by the way, speaking of Drew, I just want to remind you that later this year, Mr. Taylor has 2 more making of books coming out. We have The Art and Making of Ultraman Rising, which hits store shelves on December 3rd. And then there's The Art of Disney's Amphibia, which was originally supposed to be published on November 19th, but now seems to have a publication date of March 25th, 2025. I'm going to have to ask Mr. Taylor about that once he gets back from Palm Springs. But anyway, if you'd like to pre-order a copy of either of those making of books, you can do so at Amazon right now. And speaking of pre-ordering books, in honor of the 30th anniversary of DreamWorks, Ramin Zahed, he's the editor-in-chief of Animation Magazine, and Jerry Beck, the guy who many people, myself included, consider to be the true pioneer when it comes to covering animation history. These two have teamed up to write, well, a cinder block of a book. I mean, this thing is 576 pages long, which is why this hefty volume comes with a slipcover. And it's entitled The Art of DreamWorks Animation Celebrating 30 Years. Okay, now, just a heads up here, if you want a copy of this book, which, by the way, comes out in October, you're gonna have to start saving your pennies because it's $200 a copy. All right, so anyway, that's DreamWorks past. Looking ahead to this animation studio's future, Universal Pictures just revealed that it will be releasing Gabby's Dollhouse, the movie, to theaters on September 26, 2025. And for those of you who don't know, Gabby's Dollhouse is this live-action, computer-animated, interactive TV series that was created for DreamWorks Animation Television by Blue's Clues veterans Tracy Page Johnson and Jennifer Twomey. And this show launched on Netflix back in January of 2021 and proved to be such a hit that, well, we're not just getting Gabby's Dollhouse, the movie, in September of 2025. Starting next month, there'll be a meet and greet experience keying off of this popular preschool show to be found inside of DreamWorks Land, that newly rethemed corner of Universal Studios Florida, which right now is in the middle of technical rehearsal, but will officially open to the public in just 2 weeks' time on June 14th. Now, mind you, on that very same day, June 14th, Inside Out 2 opens in theaters. And by the way, I got my copy of The Art of Inside Out 2 this past Friday. Mind you, Chronicle Books published this 160-page hardcover back on May 14th. And I was trying to be good. I only briefly paged through this thing because I don't want this Kelsey Mann movie to be spoiled for me out ahead of actually seeing it in theaters. But I have to admit, I was intrigued to see concept art for an emotion that didn't make the cut in Inside Out 2, and that is shame. And speaking of shame, I just think that it's a shame that, well, we just spent the earlier part of today's show talking about how Furiosa, a Mad Max saga, didn't meet its box office projections. In fact, It's so funny here. I'm sitting here, folks, doing the show, and we just got an update on the box office for this fifth film in the Mad Max series, which, by the way, that series started back in April of 1979. That's 45 years ago. And as it turns out, Furiosa will edge out the Garfield movie at the domestic box office over the long Memorial Day weekend, but only by inches. Over the past 4 days in North America, Furiosa will sell 32 million worth of tickets, but the Garfield movie wound up selling $31.1 million worth of tickets, again, domestically. So there's just $900,000 that separates these two at the domestic box office. And given that industry pundits were so wrong when it came to their box office predictions for Furiosa, I'm almost kind of reluctant now to share what they've said about how well Pixar's latest is expected to do with the domestic box office. But okay, here goes. Right now, the conventional wisdom is that Inside Out 2 will sell north of $80 million worth of tickets over its opening weekend in North America, which will make it the highest grossing opening weekend for all of 2024. Now, mind you, that'd be a big step up from what happened just last year with Pixar's Elemental, which you'll remember stumbled out of the gate domestically by only selling 29.6 million worth of tickets over its opening weekend, which, just want to remind you, is what? That's 1.5 million less than the Garfield movie just earned over its opening weekend in North America. Just a reminder, though, there is a happy ending associated with Elemental. That Peter Sohn movie would eventually go on to sell 496 million worth of tickets worldwide and would definitely end up in the win column for that animation studio. And that's certainly better than Pixar's Lightyear did back in the summer of 2022. That Angus MacLane movie actually started out strong at the domestic box office with a 50.5 million worth of tickets sold over its opening weekend in North America, but then somehow seriously misfired, winding up with only 226 million of worldwide ticket sales, which, if we're being blunt here, didn't even come close to covering that animated feature's initial production and promotional costs. Which brings us to this week's sad news coming out of Emeryville, which confirmed rumors that Drew and I had heard earlier this year, a 14% staff cut at Pixar Animation Studios. The trades are reporting this as 175 staffers being let go, with most of the folks being associated with Pixar's efforts to support Disney's streaming services, producing shows like Win or Loss, which you'll remember was this 8-episode show was first announced back in December of 2020, and it is now finally supposed to debut on Disney Plus sometime later this year. Anyway, this layoff, staff cut, whatever, means we're losing talented people like Kat Hicks, a brilliant animator who worked on Turning Red and Coco and so many great Pixar films. Kat took to social media over the last day or so to acknowledge that she'd be leaving that Emeryville-based animation studio after 15 years. And Hicks stated that, "I am immensely proud of my achievements during my tenure at Pixar and am deeply grateful for the time I spent working on many Oscar-winning films." And again, that's a really gracious exit. And want to wish Kat the best of luck, and she'll be a welcome addition to whatever animation studio is lucky enough or smart enough immediately to snap her up. So what's going on here? We talked just last week on Fine Tuning about how Walt Disney Animation Studios' latest, Wish, seriously misfired at the box office, losing an estimated $130 million for the mouse. And just to be clear here, Pixar's most recent films also seem to, for one reason or another, be underperforming at the box office as well. So John Musker, the co-director of such Disney hits as The Little Mermaid, Aladdin, and Hercules, he has a theory. Musker's out on the festival circuit right now. John officially retired from Walt Disney Animation Studios more than 6 years ago, back in March of 2018 to be exact. And he then spent 4 years animating I'm Hip, which is this brand new 4-minute long hand-drawn short that John did all by himself, by the way, about a wannabe hipster feline. So, hey, we've got something in common with Garfield. And in a recent interview with El Pay, that's a top-ranked Spanish-language media outlet, Musker was asked about what he thought was happening with Disney Animation's most recent movies. Why, again, they seem to be misfiring at the box office. And John was blunt. He said, the classic Disney films didn't start out trying to have a message. They wanted you to get involved in the characters and the story and the world. And you don't have to exclude agendas, but you do have to first create characters who you sympathize with and who are compelling. And I think they need to do a course correction a bit in terms of putting the message second behind entertainment and compelling story and engaging characters. And speaking of the old days at Disney, when we get back, we're going to take a moment to acknowledge the passing of a true Disney legend, as well as direct your attention to a great new documentary about Walt Disney Feature Animation Florida. But first, this. And we're back. Before we get started here talking about Richard M. Sherman, who passed away this past week at the age of 95, I'm going to say that this will not be the deep dive I know a lot of you were hoping for. And that's because, well, my co-host on this podcast, Drew Taylor, got the opportunity to interview Dick a number of times over the past few years, and I think that fine-tuning listeners would genuinely enjoy hearing what Mr. Taylor has to say about the Sherman Brothers. So we're going to hold off on doing a really in-depth look back at Richard M's career until Drew, Katie, and Nova get back from Palm Springs. But that said, over the past 40 years, I must have gotten the chance to talk with Dick Sherman more than a dozen times, and it was always this very warm, incredibly gracious guy, eager to share his story, which is why I now like to share a story about what happened to the Sherman Brothers after Walt Disney died. Because I think it will tell you a little something about the Mouse Factory back then and how dysfunctional things got at Disney in the mid to late 1960s after Walt was gone. Now, the Sherman Brothers, Walt loved these guys. He especially loved how the boys, that's what Walt would call the Sherman Brothers, the boys, how they could handle anything he threw their way. You know, I need a song to explain what the Tiki Room is about. I need a song for this thing we're doing for General Electric for the New York World's Fair. I need a song yesterday for this Unisolf show we're doing for Pepsi-Cola. And Dick and Bob would leave Walt's office, go back to their room in the studio, bang out a quick song. Walt would say, that'll do. And that's how we wound up with the Enchanted Tiki Room. And it's a great, big, beautiful tomorrow. And it's a small world. And because the Sherman Brothers were so quick and so talented, they, just like Wally Bogue, became Walt's favorites, which did not go unnoticed by the rank and file at Disney Studios. Now, here's a part of the Disney story that the company's PR team likes to step around or studiously avoid, that how back in Walt's day, he sometimes deliberately creates friction. He'd pit people against one another with the idea that out of creative competition for his attention, by the way, well, you'd often end up with better movies, stronger ride shows and attraction for the parks. which is all well and good, except when you play favorites, those who long for the spotlight or daddy's attention will then start to resent those who are continually showered with awards, attention, and acclaim. Which brings us to what happened to the Sherman Brothers in 1967, some 6 months after Walt died. On the heels of the success of Mary Poppins, and by the way, 2 of the Academy Awards that film won for Disney Studios were a direct result of Dick and Bob's efforts, Best Song and Best Score, they'd renegotiated their contract with the studio, which then allowed the Shermans, who'd previously been under an exclusive contract at Disney, to go off and make one movie for another studio. And that project wound up being Chitty Chitty Bang Bang. Though, given that movie musical starred Dick Van Dyke, one of the co-stars of Mary Poppins, and had the same music supervisor, Irwin Costell, and the same choreographers, Mark Bro and Dee Wood, again, big parts of the Mary Poppins creative team. Well, again, if we're being honest here, this United Artists release might have well have just been called Mary Poppins 2. Anyway, when the Sherman Brothers returned to Disney, they found that the studio had changed significantly in their absence. Take, for example, their first musical for television, Hansel and Gretel. This was supposed to have been an elaborate 90-minute long production that was to have starred Geraldine Page as the witch who lived in that infamous house made of candy. Page, by the way, would eventually work for the Mouse House. You know her voice if you've ever watched Disney's The Rescuers. She's the one behind Madame Medusa, which, again, Rescuers got released to theaters in June of '77. Anyway, the Sherman Brothers wrote 6 songs for Hansel and Gretel and were very much looking forward to working on Disney's very first original musical production for television. But when Walt died in December of '66, well, this project lost its champion. And in spite of the fact that NBC had already agreed to air this special as part of its 1967-1968 season, the executives who were in charge of Walt Disney Productions now opted not to go forward with production of Hansel and Gretel. And by the way, basically the same thing happened with Bedknobs and Broomsticks. On the heels of Mary Poppins' enormous success, the studio was initially very anxious to put another big-budget musical fantasy into production. And let's be truthful here, one of the reasons they did that is because Happiest Millionaire did not do the business they'd hoped. So in April of '66, development begins in earnest on the movie musical that, at that time anyway, was known as The Magic Bedpost. But then, in 1967, again, after we lost Walt, enthusiasm for this particular project began to wane at Walt Disney Productions. And what especially concerned the Sherman Brothers was, well, their contract at the studio was due to lapse in 1968. And the new Disney management team didn't seem all that enthusiastic about extending the boys' deal with the studio. And sure enough, in 1968, the Sherman Brothers are let go by Disney, though Bill Walsh, who was the studio's top producer of that era, promised Dick and Bob that he'd eventually get the Magic Bedpost made at Disney. Mind you, it took all sorts of campaigning on Bill's part, not to mention months of behind-the-scenes finagling. But Walsh did eventually convince Disney's new management team to allow the Magic Bedpost to go into production. But then, by then, of course, the project had the name we know, we recognize as fantasy film by today, Bedknobs and Broomsticks. Sherman Brothers then returned to Disney to work on the score for this film. But they're no longer under long-term contract. They're now strictly talent per hire. More to the point, they no longer had Walt watching their back, protecting their best interests. And It's this moment in Disney history, those years between when Walt Disney passed away in December of 66 and when Michael Eisner became the Mouse House's new head cheese in late September, early October of 84. That are often the most maddening. And Steven Anderson will be exploring this topic in his upcoming book, Disney in Between the Lost Years, 1966 through 1986. This 500-page hardcover is being published later this summer by Old Mill Press. And I am, for one, am very much looking forward to seeing what Steven has to say about how the Sherman Brothers were treated by Disney management after Walt's passing. Because after these two weren't invited to continue to work at the Mouse House, they did a lot of really great work for other studios. Songs for example, the animated feature Snoopy Comes Home in 1972. Likewise, Hanna-Barbera's animated version of Charlotte's Web in 1973. Not to mention the score and the screenplays for big screen movie versions of those Mark Twain classics, Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn. These two ambitious projects were shot on location along the banks of the actual Mississippi down in Missouri and were basically released 1 year apart in 73 and 74, and arguably are some of the best work ever by the Sherman Brothers. By the way, the Sherman Brothers even tried their hand at a live-action version of that Disney classic, Cinderella. Slipper and the Rose went out into theaters in March of 76. And this whole time, Disney Studios basically has nothing to do with the Sherman Brothers, largely because of that whole Walt's favorite thing. Now, interestingly, one arm of the company would repeatedly reach out to Dick and Bob, was Imagineering. They were working on Epcot Center at the time and recognized that this theme park especially needed a bit of Sherman Brothers magic, which is why in the mid to late 70s, the Shermans were hired to write the signature songs for a number of this theme park's attractions. We've got One Little Spark and Making Memories for the Imagination Building, likewise the theme song for Magic Journeys. The Shermans also contributed the World Showcase March, as well as the theme song for a short-lived Future World show, the Astuter Computer Review. And while they had them in 1401 Flower Street, the Imagineers also had the Sherman Brothers write a theme song for Tokyo Disneyland's Meet the World attraction. And it just kind of makes me mad that the Sherman Brothers, when they were arguably at the height of their abilities, they were outside the Mouse House looking in, largely because of petty jealousy and dysfunction at the highest level of the Walt Disney Productions. I mean, back then, the executives in charge of the studio were more interested in making the 3 o'clock tea times than they were in making good movies. And anyone who's actually seen the films that Disney turned out from the early 1970s through 1984 knows this for a fact. And if I'm being honest here, I kind of feel the same way about Walt Disney Feature Animation Florida. I mean, here was this amazing little studio turning out genuinely great films like the hand-drawn version of Mulan or Lilo and Stitch, only to have the suits in California shut down the operation after 15 years in January of 2004 because... Well, if you want to know exactly what went wrong here, have I got a film for you. This brand new documentary, Beyond the Glass, the Walt Disney World Animation Building, debuted on YouTube this past Friday, May 24th. It's an hour and 40 minutes long and is primarily made up of footage that studio employees took back in the day, and not to mention some modern day interviews done with key Disney Feature Animation Florida players like Max Howard, Mark Henn, Aaron Blaise. And I'm just going to tell you right up front that if you're a Disney animation fan, this thing is kind of going to break your heart. Beyond now, also have to caution you, Beyond the Glass is a little rough around the edges, but that's largely because this thing is mostly made up of handheld video taken back in the late 1980s, early 1990s, which makes it that much more authentic. But the Walt Disney World Animation Building story is also heartfelt and passionate, and gives you a unique look at what Disney Feature Animation Florida, why it was so special. Look, I know a lot of you are still trying to get through Jenny Nicholson's 4-hour-long exploration of why Star Wars Galactic Star Cruiser failed, and just so you know, that thing over on YouTube is really worth the wait. It's worth taking the time to get all the way through this long form video. But again, to be fair to Mr. Taylor, I'm going to hold off on doing an in-depth commentary on Beyond the Glass, the Walt Disney World Animation Building. Again, this thing on YouTube until Drew gets back from Palm Springs, and then can get the chance himself to watch this thing over on YouTube. But there's no reason for you to wait. Go watch Beyond the Glass, the Walt Disney World Animation Building story now, and you can thank me later. And something else, you can thank Mr. Taylor, of course, for his Light the Fuse, the official Mission Impossible podcast, which Drew does with his equally talented co-host, Charles Hood. And while we're talking about podcasts, and we have a couple here at Jim Hill Media we'd like you to check out. We, of course, have Disney Dish that I do with Len Testa. We also have our Epic Universe podcast, which I do with Eric Hersey, the talented gentleman who edits and produces a lot of the shows here. We also have Looking at Lucasfilm with Brian Gahn, who I mentioned earlier in today's show. We also have I Want That Too, which I do with Eric's bride, Lauren Hersey. And what's interesting is that's a podcast and a video. And speaking of videos, Len and Mai's newest project, Disney Unpacked, our first ever video series, which we produce in collaboration with veteran Imagineer Jim Schul. We've got our June episode dropping tail end of this week, which is about Mater's Junkyard Jamboree, which, by the way, that ride system can now be found in 4 different Disney theme parks around the globe, and they're all powering 4 different rides. Let's see. Okay, we're at the social media portion of the show. I want to remind you that if you're looking for Drew, you can find him over on X Twitter as Drew Tailored, like in a tailored suit. As for myself, you can find me on Twitter and Instagram as Jim Hill Media, and on Facebook as Jim Hill Media News. Final favor as we head out the door here, if you could go over to Apple Podcasts and rate and review, well, not just the show you're listening to right now, find Tooning, but also Drew's and Charles's podcast, Light the Fuse, the official Mission Impossible podcast. And I think for now, that's going to do it for this week. So thanks for listening. And on behalf of Mr. Taylor, who I promise will be back for our very next show, thanks for listening, and till next time, take care.